Hello, I'm Wendy and this is a starting watercolour course. I put this course together during lockdown 2020 as part of a Learn a New Skill initiative for university students. Looking back on it, I realised that there's a lot of information here that would be relevant and useful, hopefully, to anybody who wants to start to learn to paint in watercolour. This course that I've put together on YouTube comprises mainly of the several videos I made to play to the students before doing some extra painting and demonstrating in real time with them and responding to questions. The videos are not quite as polished and edited as I would do for those made specifically for YouTube, so apologies at the beginning for any background noise and a few more hums and ha's than usual. This is the list of materials I gave to the students, and there are links to this list and to the materials themselves in the description box below the video. It's quite a long video, so I've time-stamped the several chapters, and this list can be viewed also in the description box. Following this general introduction, I'll be showing the basic materials you will need for the course, and then looking at colour mixing, including the painting and use of colour wheels. I shall move on to demonstrate flat washers and wet into wet washers, and we'll be doing two small paintings of seascapes using these techniques. You may want to follow the course at your own pace. Some of the things you will find more interesting than others, and you might want to dip in and out of it. Do what suits you, and I do hope that you get some benefit from it. Watercolours then, well, this is the sort of palette that you might think you would be using. The watercolours here are what are called watercolour pans. They're solid and they're in these little pans, hence it gets its name. And in order to use them, you have to reconstitute them. Now, if you take your paint directly from here, it's not a very good idea because you'll get all globs in it and it just won't work very well. It won't homogenise, if you like. So it's very rarely we take paint directly from here onto the paper. What you'd normally do is put it in your mixing area with some water, and then if you want to dilute it, you could add some more water to it. I like pan colours, they're nice, but I do prefer tube colours, and that's what you'll have got in your watercolour set. The Cotman colours come in two sizes. There's the 8mm and the 21mm. I do tend to buy the 21mm because they're a bit more cost effective. You'll have an empty palette in your set of watercolour materials, and it will be very similar to this one here. And what you need to do is, with each colour, is to squeeze some of it into one of these empty pans. You are going to need to use quite a bit of this tube colour, but for the purposes of now, just put a little bit in. If you did put too much colour in, you're not going to be wasting it because, like the pan colours, these tube colours will reconstitute. But what I like, you can see here, although this one's a little bit dry, they reconstitute much more easily than the pan colours, these tube colours, and you can get a much stronger mix of paint. Again, you'd put it onto your mixing area, and you'd add some water, however much you needed. But you can very quickly get a nice lot of paint using the tube colours. They're nice and soft. While again, if you use the pan colours here, quite often you'd need a lot of mixing to get the amount of colour you want. They are nice, and if people have got pan colours, please use them. Especially when you're first starting out in watercolour, they're really adequate. But if you do carry on and you find you need much stronger mixers, then tube colours is the way to go. But please, I don't discourage anybody. If you've got a nice little pan like this, then bring them along to the classes and do use them. But you'll see mainly I'll be using the tube colours. Now what you're going to do a little bit later on this morning is you're going to take your tube colours and you're going to put some in the empty pans ready to use. I'd suggest you separated them, leave some empty ones in between because you may be adding to them. And I don't like to put a really pale colour like a yellow next to a blue. Although I've done it here, I know. It's not particularly good practice. I would keep your lighter colours together. That's probably the best thing to do. Do as I say, not necessarily as I do. Moving on then from the colours, which I said we will go back to. We're going to look next at the watercolour brushes. Now there's lots and lots of brushes you can use for watercolour. I don't know if you can see these if they're on the camera. These are some of mine here. But basically for watercolour what you need is what are called round brushes. This little set you've got is really nice. It's a set I've just discovered recently actually. They're all synthetic brushes, there's no sable in them, and they're round. Clearly most of them are round. You have got one little flat brush here, which might be quite useful, but I thought it was a very good value set. And even though we might not use that a lot, you've got 4 very nice round brushes here. So like anything else that you're using, if you decide to do more watercolour and really get into it, then you can add to your brush collection. I should have said also, there's so many colours you can add to your colour selection as well. But the colours that I've actually got for you this time, you can mix any colours almost from the ones that I've given you. We'll be looking at colour mixing a bit later on in the course and you'll see that. So we've looked at the colours, we've had a quick look at the brushes, and now I think we'll have a quick look at the paper. You'll see you've got some watercolour paper. I'm not sure what size you've got it in. I think you've got it this sort of size, haven't you? This is one that I've cut down. You might feel you want to cut your sheets in half and work this size. I tend to work that size because you can see it on the camera. The watercolour paper is really, really important. Brushes are important, but the watercolour paper is vital that you use the right paper. You'll see, and I encourage you to try the watercolours on some different paper. Try them on cartridge paper, try them on board. They just won't work the same. If you're going to work in watercolour, you need the proper paper. The paper I've given you, and I can always give you links if you've not already got them, it's called Bockingford, and it's slightly textured, and the actual texture is called knot surface. I know it's a strange name, knot surface. It's also called no it's not, it's called cold pressed surface. Cold pressed. Cold pressed means it gives you a little bit of texture on there, which is quite nice. There are other papers you can get that are called rough, and clearly the texture there is much more apparent. You can also get paper called hot pressed, which is very smooth. I use the cold pressed or the knot paper, and the weight is 140 pounds. So you see it's quite a sturdy paper, isn't it? Paper goes up to, I think, well, you can use 300 pound weight, and that's very thick. I don't like that. I like this weight, so we'll stick with this for the time being, and this is the paper that you've got. We do get through quite a lot of paper, but don't waste it because it's quite expensive if you want to replace it. And also what you can do is work on the back. As you can see, I've got things here and I work on the back because I'm going to use this to do some colour swatches. So that's quite useful, so remember that. So I think we've got that paper covered. Now you'll find that you've got a pencil and a rubber in your little pack here. The pencil is a soft pencil. I think you'll see it's a 2B. It's a very, very soft pencil. And when you're painting in watercolour, you'll do a little bit of drawing, but don't worry if you're frightened about drawing. We're not doing a lot of drawing. But you will need at least to put a few lines on. It doesn't matter if they're not straight, they can be wonky. But these lines at the end need rubbing out. And so you don't press on, and you don't press on particularly with a very hard pencil because it will never rub out. So very pale lines, can you see that? Very pale, soft lines with a soft pencil. And then the rubber you may have may be a putty rubber, or it may be a Derwent Arte Eraser. I can't remember which one I said, but they're both very good. Talking about rubbing out though, the rubbers will disturb the surface of the watercolour paper. So it's best not to rub out too much. Rub out as little as possible if it's the paper you're going to paint on. You can always practice on another sheet of paper. In fact, what I do quite often, if I've got a drawing that is a little bit complicated, I draw it on cartridge paper and then I trace it using a light box onto my watercolour paper so that I'm not doing lots and lots of rubbing out. So what else will you need? You will need a water pot to make it quite a big water pot, or some people have 2 water pots, one to wash the brushes in and one to take clean water. You don't need to worry too much about your water getting that dirty, as long as you've got a big volume of it. So you're going to need a water pot, you're going to need some kitchen roll. That's really quite important, you get through quite a lot of kitchen roll. And what else? I think that's about it. Watercolour generally will wash off anything, so you don't really need to start wearing aprons and things like that when you're painting in watercolour. You can if you want. Most colours will come off. You'll learn as you go through the course that some colours, one or two, are staining. So you do have to be a little bit more careful with those. I think that's about it for the time being. So I'm hoping this is going to be very useful for you and to maybe refer back to when it comes to the materials. We've had the introduction to materials, and now we're going to have a look at the colours in a bit more detail and do some colour swatches. I'm going to start by taking one of my colours and putting it into the mixing area. And what I'd like you to do is try and get the colour as concentrated as you can. You'll need a little bit of water to do this, otherwise it won't spread. Try and get it as concentrated as you can. And then what you're going to do is just do a few lines like this with it, and then take your water and add some water to it. Do a few more lines, a bit more water to it, and you should see it getting paler. You might just need to go into one little area like this just to make it go paler a little bit quicker. See? Doing this means that you're getting some idea of how dark this colour is and how light it is when you're adding water to it. Now this colour is ultramarine. I'm going to end up by just putting water on there like that. This colour is ultramarine. Now by doing this you can see the darkest you're ever going to get this colour. I could probably get this a little bit darker if I hadn't put quite so much water in to start. But you're going to see the darkest you're going to get this colour, and then you're also going to see the lightest you can get it. Now with watercolour we don't use white to make colours lighter, we add more water like this. This is a really useful exercise to do, and what I'd like you to do with each of your colours is to do at least one of these, and then when you've done that do label it, because when you go back to look at your colours you're going to forget what it was. So wherever you want to label it, probably I might do this at the top here. What did I say it was? Ultramarine. And I think, I don't know how many colours you've got actually, probably about 6 or 7. So what you want to do is rinse off your brush, and then you're going to go into one of your other colours. So let's go into this raw sienna of mine here. It's a touch dried up. So I'm hoping you can see this. So we're going to get the raw sienna. It's experience tells you how much more water to put in there, so don't worry about that. You just have a bash. So we'll look at the raw sienna. Now that's about as dark as the raw sienna will ever be. So I'm going to put a bit of water with it. See if I can get it lighter. So just do your best on this, just to see how quickly you can get it lighter. You don't want to go off the end of your paper down here. You might have to end up adding almost pure water. But you can see I'm getting sort of a gradation there of that colour. I'll do a few more and then I'll show you the whole lot when I've finished. So here I've done swatches of most of the colours, and you can see the difference in adding the water, the difference in the tone. I'll be talking about tone a lot, and tone just means the lightness and darkness of a colour. So we've got the darkest tone here at the top and the lightest at the bottom where we've added more water. I could have added quite a bit more water to some of these. They could go lighter still, but I would have gone off the end. So we'll leave it at that. But you can get the idea of this, and what I'd like you to do is to do this with all your colours. It will really get you used to them, and it will get you used to their names as well. And if you pop the names somewhere, then you can look back on it and it'll be a good guide for you. Talking about guides, what I'd also like you to do, this is a photograph of a palette of a friend of mine. And this was when she was really starting to get into watercolours. And she had a lot more colours than we've got than you've got at the moment. But what she's done here, as you can see, is a plan of where her colours are. Now in your little palette, if you want to, you can try and mark on the names of the colours and where you put them, but I find it's very difficult to do that. There's very little writes on the plastic, and if you get something to write on the plastic, it gets rubbed off. It's a good idea to give yourself a plan like this. Clearly it's not got to be as neat as this. It depends on your personality and how you like to organise yourself. But it is a good idea to, if you can as well, to actually write down the name. So in this case we've got indigo, which is here. So my friend has written the name and also done a very small swatch, a sort of mid-tone, to give you an idea of the colour. So she's got indigo, her blues here, indigo phthalo, which you've got, Winsor and Prussian. Prussian blue and phthalo blue are very similar, they're very cold blues. She's got ultramarine, she did this a little bit light. Is there anything else here? The reds, I think we've got the cadmium red. What else have we got here? We've got the yellows, the cadmium yellow I think you have. The burnt umber, the burnt sienna again. This is a little bit light, it might just be the photograph. Try and get a mid-tone on them, but it's a really nice plan, and you do need to know the names of your colours. She's got some quite nice mauves here. Again though, you'll see we can mix some of these colours with our reds and blues, so we're not going to worry too much about having too many colours. You'll notice I haven't given you a green deliberately, because we're going to mix the greens. I'm sure some of you will know how to mix a green if you think back to your schooling. And then we've got some darker colours here. She's actually got a black in here. It's we tend not to use these very dark greys and blacks in watercolour, but you know, all these colours are useful. So I think that's, I thought I'd show you that because that is really nice. I'm not sure what her palette is looking like now because this was done some years ago. So to recap then, what I'm hoping to do in this first lesson, and I'm putting this video together for people who may have missed or want to just go back and refresh. What we're going to do in the lesson is I'm going to demonstrate doing these colour swatches, and then I'm going to suggest to people that in their own time over the next week, part of their homework, because I give homework, is to give themselves a little plan like this of their palette. If you have any more watercolours that you know you have already, if you've been doing a little bit of painting, you can put them in your palette. That's no problem at all. Making your own colour wheels is a really good way of getting to know your colours. And I'm just going to briefly describe what we're going to do. You want to draw around some things I've done here that's a sort of suitable size. You might want to try 1 or 2 sizes. If you're very good and you're a mathematician, you can get out your compass and all sorts of things, but just sort of guessing where these lines are going to go, so that it will give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 triangles inside the circle there. I may be referring to these as pizza slices. What you're going to learn by doing this exercise is to realise that if you take 3 primary colours, a red, a yellow and a blue, you can mix any number of secondary colours from them. And what you'll also realise is these secondary colours are going to be very different depending on what primary colours you chose. Say for example you wanted a nice spring green with a blue and a yellow. Now that nice spring green is not necessarily going to be very easy to mix, but if you've done some colour wheels, you can have a look at them, find that nice spring green that you were looking for, and see which primary colours you used to make it on your colour wheels. You may be wondering exactly what a primary colour is. It's usually defined as being a red, yellow and a blue, but clearly there are different red, yellows and blues, and as a primary colour, when you're doing colour wheels, the primary colours that are chosen are the ones with the least contamination, if you like, or influence of other colours. For these colour wheels, we're going to be investigating the colours that I gave you in your packet materials. For the primary red, we're using cadmium red. Primary yellow is the cadmium yellow, and in this case I'm going to be using the intense blue, the phthalo blue. So you can see what I'm doing here. What you want to do is to mix up each of the three primary colours and to paint the little pizza slice that applies to them. Try and use a mid-tone, that's nothing too light and nothing too dark, and keep it very transparent and just put it on in one layer so that you're not getting lots of layers of paint on top of each other. You can see that I've labelled the colours, and you must do this on your colour wheel, don't forget, because if you do lots of these and you don't label them, when you go back you're going to forget what they are and it's not going to be a good reference for you. Here I've got colour wheels showing the different combinations of the primary colours that you've got, the red, yellows and blues. I've duplicated the wheel that's on the top left of the picture here because that's the one I'm going to demonstrate mixing the secondary colours from. So I'm going to mix the red and the yellow, I'm going to mix the blue and the yellow and the blue and the red. This is just a photograph of the different combinations that I worked out. You will probably just work on one colour wheel at a time, so you might start on the top left one, as I'm going to demonstrate now. So what I'm doing is I'm going to mix equal quantities, or as near as I can to equal quantities, of the cadmium red and the cadmium yellow. This takes a little bit of practice, especially if you've not done any colour mixing before. Don't get too uptight about it. Just do your best. Just mix as equal quantities as you can of the two colours to get an intermediary colour, as I'm putting on here, and just paint it in the same way. And now I'm mixing the cadmium red with the ultramarine blue, trying to add approximately equal amounts of each to make a purple. And then finally we make our green with the cadmium yellow and the ultramarine blue. I think you can see, particularly on this colour mix, that I'm loading my brush quite a lot. I'm going back to this pool of colour that I've mixed and keep loading the brush when I'm applying the paint. You don't want to spread the paint around too much, otherwise it will, well, it will be too thin. It will soak into the paper and you'll get a very, very pale colour. So it is really important to keep going back to that pool and to make sure that you mix enough up to be able to do that. I don't think there'll be time to start this in class, on the first class. There may be, but this is the homework for the week anyway, to have a go at these colour wheels. So in the last lesson we were looking at colour mixing, and I was telling you about the usefulness of doing your own colour wheels and looking at your own colours and seeing what other colours you could make from them. This was a very simple colour wheel, and you were mixing your primary colours to produce secondary colours. One of the things we're looking at today regarding colours now is whether they're warm or cool. A cool colour generally is thought of as being blue, or a colour with blue in it, and a warm colour is red and oranges and also your yellows. The colour wheel is divided into a warm side and a cool side, so you can see here where I've marked on the warm colours being the reds, oranges and yellows, and the cooler colours being the purples, the blues and the greens. I can try to explain the warmness and coolness of a colour if we just take a look at mixing greens from the yellows and the blues. I would imagine when you were doing all this mixing for homework that you were finding it quite difficult to mix a secondary colour with equal amounts of the primary colours. It looks as if I may have got it just about right here. But what I'm doing now is deliberately adding more of the blue. So you can see what I've got here when I paint it is a very bluey green. Now this green is a cold green because it's got all that blue in it. And what I'm doing next is I'm deliberately mixing a very yellowy green. So as you can no doubt guess, we've got a nice warm green here. You can see the difference between this warm green with the more yellow and the cool green with the more blue in it. And it's really important that you have an understanding of this when you come to do your painting. For example, if you were going to paint trees in the distance, you'd want a cool green to paint them because they're further away and cooler colours recede. Warmer colours, on the other hand, come forwards and bring things more forward in your picture, so foreground trees may well be a yellowy green. The colours that we've just been mixing, the warm green and the cooler green, and the other colours that we've had a practice with, they're called the tertiary colours, and it's possible to do an even more complicated colour wheel putting some of these tertiary colours on. You have to give yourself a circle with 12 pizza slices, and it always confuses me how to do it, so I've demonstrated it here for you, which I hope will be a help. You may feel you need a bigger colour wheel than you did for those first ones that you did. Right, this looks a lot of fun, doesn't it? And don't worry, I don't expect you to do a tertiary colour wheel for all the colours that you've got in your palette, but do try and do at least one, because it will help you understand the colour temperature of your colours and how to mix these tertiary colours. I started off on the left hand side here by putting in the primary colours, and here I'm using cadmium red, cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue. Once that's done, then I mix the blue and the yellow to make the secondary green, the red and the yellow to make the secondary orange, and the red and the blue to make the secondary purple. So far so good. So if we go back to look at the example of the green, what you want to do now is mix a secondary green, then add some more yellow to it, paint that in, and you've got your yellowy green. Take your secondary green again, add blue to it, make it cooler, paint that in so you've got your tertiary bluey green, and then you do the rest with the two other colours. So this is a homework task for you over the week. We won't be doing it in class, but I do hope you manage to get one done. In this class we're looking at putting on a watercolour wash. A watercolour wash basically means an area that's covered with watercolour paint. That area could be the size of a postage stamp, it could be the size of this area that I've painted here, which is about 6 by 4 inches, or it could cover a large sheet of paper. It's a watercolour wash, and there are different sorts of washes, and the wash we're looking at today is called a flat wash. Next week we'll be looking at a graduated wash and moving on to wet into wet washes. A little picture that we'll be painting today using flat washers, I've taken an idea from this book by J. Garcia. It's quite an advanced book. I don't necessarily recommend that you buy it at the moment, but if you do see it for sale on somewhere, like Amazon or a second-hand bookshop, it's certainly worth you picking it up. And we'll be painting something along these lines. We'll be simplifying this little picture here using flat washes, and I think I'll probably put some trees in the foreground. This picture is comprised of a series of flat washes that are built up on top of each other, and that's what I'll be demonstrating today. There's a very nice site called Pixabay where you can get royalty-free stock photographs that you can use for artwork, and I found this one, which is really nice, isn't it? It really demonstrates aerial perspective, that is, the things in the distance receding, and there's a nice overlapping here of the mountains, the distant mountain range being much paler and then gradually coming forward and getting darker. You could use this or little bits of this for your mountain project if you like, rather than doing the drawing that I've given you, or do it as a separate one. This is the drawing I'll be using of the mountain range. So we've just got 3 overlapping mountains, if you like, and we're going to do a series of washes, flat washes, to paint the picture. The colour I'm using here is burnt sienna, which is a nice warm red. It's an earth colour, but it is called a red. So we're going to build this picture up with a series of flat washes that I'm going to demonstrate. And don't worry if your tones, the lightness and darkness of your burnt sienna isn't exactly the same as mine. It won't be. It might be interesting for you to do 1 or 2 of these. What I'm demonstrating here is what's known as a textbook way of putting on a flat wash. You should be able to master this before moving on, really, but every time you put on a flat wash, you don't necessarily do it quite in this way. Once you get the hang of it, you can cut a few corners with it. I have a big pool of colour mixed, and this is the first layer, so it's quite a light colour. I've got the board at an angle. Experiment with different angles on the board and see which works best for you. You don't need too much of a slope, but you just need the paint to be able to sort of move down the paper. And every time I'm going across the wash area, can you see I'm going back to my pool of colour, loading the brush, and then I've got this sort of little wet edge here that I'm picking up every time. I think it's called the bead, I'm not sure, but this sort of wet edge, or bead as I'm calling it, has to be there. You have to keep that there till you get down to the bottom. When you reach the bottom, you may find that you've got a lot of paint there and you don't need to go back to the pool. You can spread that paint out down to the bottom. If you've got quite a lot of paint left down there at the bottom that's sort of puddling, dry off your brush and then you can soak it up. So the aim of this exercise is to produce a nice, flat, even wash with no brush lines going across. So now I'm working on the first mountain range here. I've done another flat wash. You can see the bottom left corner there, there's a few runbacks happening, but this does happen with watercolour. Don't worry about it. You can see now, putting on this second range of mountains here, that I'm still trying to keep my strokes horizontal. Don't outline the top of the mountain and then try and put the rest of the wash on, or you might end up with a sort of outline at the top of there. So try and keep all the strokes horizontal and work in the same way with this darker mix. In watercolour you always have to work light to dark, and this little picture is a good example of that. We're starting with our lightest and then we're putting the layers over the top, working light to dark all the time. You have to work light to dark in watercolour because you can't put a light colour over a dark colour, as you can with a medium such as acrylic. You can see here I had to remove, I held the paper up, I had to remove that puddle of colour with a dry brush, otherwise it would have run back into the picture when I laid it flat. And now I've mixed up a stronger mix of the burnt sienna, and I'm going to work in exactly the same way. Again, just be very careful when you start out. Make sure your brush is fully loaded and don't outline the tops of the mountains, and work your strokes horizontally. And now we come to the nearest range of mountains here, with again a darker mix, working in exactly the same way. I can't stress enough that the paper has to be really dry in between putting these washes on. You could work on one or two at the same time rather than just sitting and watching paint dry. Also, you can use a hairdryer. Once you put the paint on, and if it's still wet and a little bit runny, don't use the hairdryer straight away. Let the paint sink into the paper and then hold the hairdryer a foot or two away from the paper and move it about, and you can dry the paint. I did that with these. So here's the cropped picture, this one that I did. I think these washes are looking okay. The next stage, when it was totally dry, of course, is to rub out the pencil lines. Continue practicing these, and as part of the homework this week, I'd like you to have a go at doing one with your ultramarine. So you're going to end up then with the mountain range in warm colours and one in a cool blue. In the last class we looked at putting on flat washes, and in this class we're going to be looking at putting on graduated washes and putting on a simple seascape. I've taken the idea from this book that you can see here, which is by Brian Thatcher. It's a nice little book if you can lay your hands on it, just for doing very simple watercolours. The colours I'm using here are ultramarine and burnt sienna. I've knocked back the ultramarine with a little bit of burnt sienna in the mix to give more of a grey rather than a brighter blue. So here I've got a full sheet of your paper, the size that you got in your pack, and I've divided it into 4, and we'll be working on that size. I've kept it this size because it prevents the paper from bending and cockling as much as if you were painting on a small piece. And I'm starting off doing the graduated wash in a similar way to we did the flat wash, but as I'm bringing the paint down, as I'm picking up that bead with the loaded brush, you can see I'm adding more water to the mix on the palette. Every time I go across, I add a little bit more water, well, a brush load of water to it, and then I carry on in the same way. So in this way you get the gradation of colour, starting at the top from your darkest mix that you made initially and then diluting it down to the bottom. So in this case you don't need to mix up as much paint as you did for the flat wash. For the flat wash you had to mix up enough paint to cover the whole paper, but in this way you're diluting it down, so you don't need to do that. When you get nearer the bottom, if you find that it's not going light enough, add a little bit more water to your mix, or you'll see I think what I did at the end of this, I added almost pure water to the bottom. Looking at the wash I did here, it's not graduating quite as much as I would like. It's a bit darker at the top, but that doesn't matter at all because we're going to be using these washes mainly for skies, and skies get lighter at the bottom, but it's not always very even, so don't worry about it, just do your best. You can see here I'm adding mainly water to get it really light at the bottom, and then I'm going to pick up the bead of paint at the bottom with a dryish brush. Let the washes thoroughly dry. You probably need to use a hairdryer, and then when they are dry, then just pencil in very lightly the shape of the headland on there. And now I've got a stronger mix and making quite a mess here, as you can see. The trouble with this little palette is it leaks, but not to let that bother me. We shall just carry on. Watercolour's all about making a mess. So as you can see here, what I'm doing, I'm actually filling in this headland, but I'm working in a similar way to we put on the flat washes. I'm starting at the top of the headland and I'm working downwards, and I'm not outlining it first. Now looking at his painting, although we're not copying it exactly, we're getting an idea, an inspiration from it, if you like, to do our own painting. There is a darker tone below the headland. Mine is rather pale there. So what I'm going to do here is just put on another graduated wash, starting underneath the headland. So I'm going to work in a similar way. I'm going to add water to the mix as I come down. And that will be a way of making the tones of the sea stronger. And that little bit of white I've left underneath the headland is done deliberately. I meant it to go all the way along, but I missed some bits, as you do. And then I'm adding more water as I come down, as you can see, and I think that little line under the headland looks quite nice, and you often see that actually. It might be waves or something breaking along the headland. And now again we have to leave this to dry thoroughly. You might find that it will work better, and these graduated washes do work better if you put them at more of an angle than you were doing for the flat washes. You can see here I'm lifting it up almost vertically, letting some of the colour run down. I would let it dry at an angle as well, and don't put the hairdryer on it too soon or you'll disturb the graduated wash. And now with a smaller brush, just suggest some of the waves. Just be quite confident in bringing the stroke across the paper. You can practice a little bit on some practice paper. You can't quite see it, but that's what I'm doing here beneath the painting. Just practice making some quite bold strokes going straight across the paper, keeping it horizontal, not worrying too much, breaking them up and not having them too dark. Now for the sand in front here, I've used almost pure burnt sienna, and if I remember I put a little bit of raw sienna with it, so it wasn't quite as orange. It's up to you, just make a mix that you like that goes on the front there, and then again with some nice bold strokes suggest the sandy area, similar to he's done in front of the picture. Again, we're talking about warmer and cool colours. This lovely warm colour here will bring the foreground forward, and your bluier greys should go into the distance. Try not to fiddle too much, just a few strokes. There we go. So that's about it. This is what we're going to practice in class, and I'm showing his picture again here because it's important that you don't try to copy things too exactly. People who've been painting for years and years, they try to copy a picture so that it's exactly the same, and there's no way you're ever going to be able to do that. Just get an inspiration, as I said before, get ideas from something like this and then adapt it for your own colours. I suggest that you stick to these colours first and have a bit of practice, and then during the week you could try some different colours. Remember to keep the paler colours in the distance and make them warmer as you come forwards, and don't fiddle too much. Try not to go back into your painting. Try and work around what's happened with your washes rather than trying to go in there and potch with them and mess about with them. Today we're looking at wet into wet washes and painting another simple seascape, but this time I'm using a photograph of mine as a reference. It's a very attractive peninsula called Worm's Head at Rhossili in West Wales, fairly close to where I'm living. I'm working on a piece of paper here. The image size is about 9 inches by 7 inches, and I've drawn the horizon line about 2.5 inches down and then drawn on the headland. And what I'm doing now, I'm putting on a very, very dilute wash of a red. I think cadmium red will be your red. Put lots of water with it and just cover the page. It's not a textbook flat wash or anything like we did before. You're just using very dilute paint, lots of water, and you're just soaking the paper with it. And I'll be demonstrating this as well in the class. And as I come down the paper, I'm going to add a little bit of the raw sienna to the red, just to make it a slightly warmer colour as it comes forward. But again, keep everything very dilute. And now I've got some ultramarine with just a tiny bit of burnt umber in it, so it's not too bright. And I'm dropping it in rather than painting it in. I'm putting plenty of paint on the brush, and I'm sort of dropping it in and not spreading it around too much into that wet sky. And this is what is called a wet into wet wash, and that blue should diffuse into that first wash that you put on. As you can see, you can move the paper around. You might find it's running too fast down the page if it's too wet. So just lift the paper up and move it around so that you get some nice cloud forms appearing. I'm just moving the edges of this wash with a dryish brush because I just feel they distract me a little bit. Just let the watercolour do its own thing, let it move around a little bit till you're quite happy with it. And remember that it is going to dry back in strength as well. So you can see now that the sky is dry. It did dry back, you can see the difference, and I've got some sort of paler areas there that stand for clouds. And now what I'm going to do is paint on the headland, the worm's head, and I'm mixing up a mix of, again, the ultramarine, just knocked back with some burnt sienna. We don't want it too black, and we don't want it a bright blue. So judge it, and then as I've done, just try out little bits on a scrap of paper. You don't want to be putting this on with the paint too dry. You want a nice loaded brush, and you want to remember how to put on the flat washers so that you're not outlining, and you keep going back to your pool so that you're loading your brush very often when you're painting this in. And then this headland will be transparent. It will be a darkish tone, but you'll still see the paper coming through, and you only want to put one layer of this on. You can see that I'm getting some little puddles on there, which is good. It means the brush is loaded, and then I'm going to fill in the whole of the headland there with this colour. You can see from the photographic reference that I gave you that there's like a sparkle on the water, isn't there, particularly on the right hand side. And I think we talked about this last week. You can get that effect using what's called a dry brush effect with the brush. As you bring the brush along, you're running out of paint and you're getting that sparkle. And have a little practice on some paper, and that's what we're going to aim for now on the area of sea below the headland. And then as I come forward, I'm going to put a little bit more in places where the sand is as well. I added a touch more ultramarine to the mix here. You can see I'm adjusting the strength at the left hand side. I'm just making it a little bit stronger as it was on the photograph. This has got to be left to completely dry, so we'll probably use the hairdryer on it. And then what I'm going to do is put on some, again, sort of wet into wet wash coming down. It's not going to be too careful, keep it very wet. And I'm sort of starting at the top with a bit of raw sienna. And I'm missing the areas where the blue is, possibly leaving a little bit of white to give a bit of sparkle. So I'm putting on some raw sienna and then I'm dropping some burnt sienna in it to make it a bit warmer. Everybody's will be different, so don't worry about it. Just keep it nice and spontaneous with some big strokes across the paper, raw sienna and then some burnt sienna dropped into it, and then getting a little bit darker as you come forward. But again, there's no need to go too dark on this. As I'm painting this, you'll be noticing that I'm dropping occasionally some darker paint into the lighter mix that's underneath. This is just to ring the changes and so that the whole area isn't one flat tone. You've got a few lights and darks, a few light and dark stripes going across, so it's making it a bit more interesting. Make the darks that much darker as you come forward. I'm going to leave this video here. Depending on time in the class, we might put some foreground rocks onto this. I put some rocks on the front and this was my final picture. I cropped it and it's almost like, you put it in a mount and it looks so much better when you've got rid of the jagged edges. As you can see, I just added a few seagulls to show some signs of life there. Well, this brings us to the end of the course, and as I said at the beginning, I do hope that you found something useful in it. For absolute beginners, I think it will be extremely useful, but also if you're a little bit new to watercolour but you've been doing a little bit, I think you'll also find that you've got some good tips here and some help. As always, if you did like the video, then give me a thumbs up, and if you want to know what I'm going to be doing in the future and you don't want to miss out, you can subscribe to my channel. Well, bye for now.